and maybe I'll kickstart the discussion. I want to get your insights about the costs for developers to adopt such a solution. So what I have in mind is maybe performance inconsistencies across browsers, or maybe do you envision that it's harder to debug such a diversified program in the wild? What are your thoughts on that?
So, well, regarding the performance, I would say that we measure two things mostly. First, the size of the variance, the size of the binary, because this is an issue in the network, and we can say that we go from 80% of the initial size to 125% of the initial size. But the thing here is that the code section, that's the one that we are modifying in the WebAssembly module, is, I will say, that is not the most representative in the binary. So I will say that this size drawback in the 125% is not can be disregarded as a performance issue. And regarding the execution time, since we are retargeting a super optimizer, we have both cases. We are generating variants which are faster than the original one, and variants that are a little bit slower than the original. So definitely this can be tuned in Crow somehow to generate only performance variants. So I would say that performance is not an issue for our tool.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just a bit worried about this perception of uniform performance, right? So if you deploy a piece of code, you would expect it to behave more or less the same on different machines, right? Or in different browsers. And if you start deploying diversified binaries, then you will get random reports from the user. So do you maybe envision a way to report which variant was out there in the wild that produced this performance regression or something like that?
No, we haven't thought about it, but that's definitely a good point. But since we control from which transformations we are doing the variance generation, definitely this is something that can be done quite easy to provide some kind of information about this variant is providing some issues from the user. We can know exactly which transformation we are applying, and we can know the problem from where to work.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. We don't have a question yet in the Slack channel, but I invite you all to add it there. But we have a statement here. So people, Ben in particular, is thanking you for making the tool public, so that other researchers can build on your work, and we see quite some approval for that statement. I think we all agree that that's a very beneficial effort for our community. So before we get further questions, I maybe want to follow up on the debugging part. So can you comment on that? So let's say one of this variant would crash in the wild. So do you have any insight on what the developers could do? Will you get a stack and the
Okay, so think about that every time, for example, that you refresh a page, you will get a new variant. So this variant will crash in one of this refresh, but in the other, it's less probable to crash somehow. So maybe the first thing that you can do is just refresh your browser. But definitely something that we need to measure. But I will say that since we are using a pretty well-tested tool to build our own tool for diversification, I would say that it's quite low probable that you have a crash in the variant.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for your answer. I suggest we move to the panel discussion. Oh, please, Chris.
I have one more comment, question, kind of discussion point. So I'm personally all up for binary diversification, and obviously it's a little easier for WebAssembly in that sense. But we also at some point thought about distributing different binaries for Firefox. Obviously, that was also a research project. But then for Firefox, it was harder because we would have to pre-compile like millions and millions of versions, which we could then ship to end users. And one of the other big problems that we were having, and that you just touched, is the debugging. Like if something crashes, you need a stack report. And then also what random seed you use to kick off the random compilation or whatever you use to diversify the binary, right? So in that case, also what you mentioned, and I think that is very critical for a real world implementation of whatever we do in that space. And I love that we do research in that space, is that we communicate back somehow, because you mentioned, for example, if it crashes, you just reload it. Yes, that fixes the problem for the end user for that particular problem. But then obviously you also want to report back to the person who provides the application, or to the company that provides the application, that they can fix the problem on their end, right? Because obviously there is some kind of problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing your experience with that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree it's an issue, and also reloading a page is not a really good solution after all. I mean, you are attempting against the user experience. But I would say it would be good to see also variants where assembly crashing the browser at some point, right? I mean, this means that you can improve after all the system browser.
Once again, thank you for the discussion. I suggest we open our discussion for the panel, for the rest of the paper authors. So feel free to ask questions in the Slack. And yeah, maybe I want to kickstart the discussion with like future-looking questions. So maybe for each author. So how do you see the browser ecosystem changing in response to what you're proposing? So for example, for the WebAssembly diversification project, so do you envision that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see a lot of attacks that this approach could be used against? And what type of attacks, maybe, Javier?
Sorry, I realized now that I had my camera turned off.
We still cannot see you.
Okay, that's
black screen.
That's interesting. Apparently, it's not working.
It's okay.
So, anyways, yeah. So the question is how I'm seeing the web in the future, right? Or somehow.
In particular, the WebAssembly domain and attacks on WebAssembly.
So it's we should expect even more vulnerabilities in the future, I would say. For example, if you see the roadmap of WebAssembly right now and what is the future plan for WebAssembly, they are working in even having multi-threading and multi-memory and the thing, and this is obviously an increase in the surface attack, or probably. So we should expect more vulnerabilities in the future, even with the super accurate timing attacks, I would say.
Okay.
So yeah. It's something to be aware of, and I won't say that it's that we are repeating the history with the previous frameworks, like if you remember, for example, Java applets or Flash, for example, because it's a common effort and it's a super well thought work, I would say. But definitely we should be aware of this. We should be aware about security in WebAssembly.
So another question for discussion that is more generic is about policies around extensions in terms of, as far as I know, maybe I'm unaware of this, but if there is a solution, but can you tell the browser to, for example, block an extension just for a certain specific website or a set of websites? Create either an allow list or a block list, right? So say I want to install an extension. I really like this extension, yet I don't trust it at all. So I want it to run to remove ads from whatever website, but I don't want it to be enabled in any way on my banking website. Why can't we do that? I mean, it seems like it should be fairly easy to do, but as far as I know, this is not possible at the moment.
There is an ad blocker, for example, right? So, which is a very similar mechanism in that sense, what you had just said. From a technical perspective, I think that would be fairly easy doable. Mm-hmm. If you really want to go down that route, I'm not sure.
Because I guess I don't want to install an extension that blocks an extension, right? I trust the browser. Right? I trust Firefox, I trust Chrome. I don't trust the extension. So I would like the browser to offer me this possibility of saying, hey, I want to apply these fine-grained policies on my extensions. I think it would be a very nice feature to have.
Definitely. And Shubham, can you tell your thoughts on that? And maybe on a related note, should some of these extensions get permissions that the user sees? So similar to my point about documentation, that the user knows upfront that, for example, the extension modifies the security header.
As far as I'm as far as I know, so there are certain group of permissions for example, there are like non-security critical permissions for which the user intervention is not required. I mean, this is all about the extension model and how the permission system works. So as for the example, say for example, if we want to allow certain things on host A but not on host B, it's going to go down to the route of like host-based permissions is what we are going to look at. Or to configure something which the browser tells the extension to perform certain activities at one domain, but do not perform the same thing at the another domain. I'm not really sure whether it could be permission specific or domain specific. How this would target or how this would be generalized to all the extensions at once. So I'm not really sure about how this could be a generic solution made for all the domains and extensions. Probably I need to say think about it and look at the permission models again and then come on it.
I have to add something that Roberto touched briefly earlier. So the end user doesn't really know what the end user wants. And I'm not sure if Emily is still on the call, but I know that the Chrome folks have done a bunch of studies around that. Whatever you present to the user doesn't really know what to do, right? And how to deal with all these prompts, because you said you want more interaction in that sense, right? And what we have seen in our studies, and I'm pretty sure the Chrome folks can confirm that, is that the user basically clicks whatever the user wants to get to the content in the end, right? We are all super security-minded people, but there is a big difference between the few of us in terms of who are so worried about security all the time versus the rest of the population.
I can jump in there. I actually, I have a somewhat different opinion on that. I actually wrote a blog post on this. I think I'll just post the link to the blog post in the chat and then leave it at that. I think it depends. I don't know. I have a more optimistic view on whether on how users perceive security warnings, and I think it's kind of a misconception that people always just like click yes to get to what they want to do. But obviously open for debate, and I'll just leave the blog post there.
But there's a slight difference, just to follow up on that, versus the extension provides so much input where you can choose versus the browser provided security warnings, in particular about like the URL bar and whatnot, right? That is a slightly different story than what Roberto here suggested, in my opinion. So we have to differentiate between those two things.
Yeah, I think I like to push the message that like it is possible to build prompts and warnings that are adhered to, if not comprehended, and but yeah, the specifics of the particular use case matter a lot.
Can I offer another question, since we're talking about security warning, to see what your opinion is on this on the browser side? So say that you have a very popular extension like an ad blocker or something of that. So any extension really, it doesn't matter what it is. And say that as the browser itself implements some sort of essentially a whitelist of some sort that lists, say, banking websites or websites that are known to be extremely sensitive in terms of the information that the user can get out of them or enter, and at the very least offer a warning of the kind, hey, you have this extension, an ad blocker, and this extension can actually see the entire content of your banking website. Do you really want this extension to run or to have visibility on this site? You can allow it to have visibility on anything else, but not and operate the way it does, but not on your banking website. And obviously, the question will need to be phrased in a good way, not the way I pose it, but then cache the answer, right? So if the user says, no, I don't want my ad blocker to look at my banking website, then you cache that answer and you move forward, and you kind of dynamically create a user-specific whitelist or blacklist of some sort. I don't know.
May I add something to that as well? Because that is a very, very important question here. And there is a slight difference between the web extension, which you actively install, Versus what, in my opinion, is way more critical is that even like I had that example at one of our Mozilla Security Research summits where my banking website actually included third-party content into my actual, they could see all my account transactions, right? I mean, they had access to it. So that is even more critical in my opinion, right? And I have no influence over that at all. For what it's worth, I called the bank. They didn't initially even realize the security problem, but eventually I got through to the developers and then they removed it.
Nice.
A related proposal that's been floating around Chrome land. I don't know if this has been discussed much publicly yet, but there's a proposal floating around for web permissions, not extension permissions, just web permissions, to like define categories of apps by their functionality and then vary the permission request UI based on the category of app. So like maybe a particular web app declares itself to be a banking app or a word processing app or a maps app, and then we can sort of say like, okay, it's natural that if the user says, I want this app to be my maps app, then it's natural that that app would be asking for geolocation permission, but maybe not for access to your contacts or things like that, or maybe, I don't know. But yeah, so that's kind of a related proposal to get apps to let apps declare themselves and be approved to be in a particular category of functionality, and then vary the privileges that they get or can ask for.
That brings about a number of security questions as well in terms of abuse, right? A malicious app that declares itself as a banking or maybe a maps app just to gain whatever permissions from the user. How do you get around that? Because then you would have to do the same thing that happens with the extensions or with the Play Store in general for apps. You need to start patrolling and enforcing, or at least detecting abuse and then enforcing policies and so on and so forth. Do you, is this a preliminary proposal? Do you have any information about the security aspects of it?
Yeah, it's not a, it is very preliminary and not straightforward by any means. I think the idea is that the user would have to approve the association, and then it wouldn't necessarily grant, like auto grant any privileges, but maybe, you could imagine it even being like restrictive in some ways, like an app that the user says is my maps app can't ask for certain privileges. But I don't think it would auto grant any privileges.
Yeah, thanks for the great discussion. I think we are approaching the time to wrap up this panel session, but I promised in the chat that I'll give the opportunity for one question that was raised during the session. So, Hugh, can you please ask your question?
Oh, I don't think it was a question. It was just a suggestion in Slack.
Okay. Well, then sorry, my bad. Yeah, maybe since I dropped that question about the future-looking part, I think Christoph didn't have the chance to give his answer on that. So you speculated a bit on when do you envision this HTTPS only to be adopted as, or HTTP not only, but as an option, HTTPS only as default. But do you also envision a time when HTTPS content will be the only content served in the browser? Should we go in that direction?
I'm not entirely sure if we should go in that direction. I'm all up for trying HTTPS and secure versions first, but I always kind of have that analogy, like back in the days, we burned so many books and now we don't have access to those books anymore, right? And there is a lot of web pages out there who are just unmaintained. And for some of those, it's not even critical that, they don't need to be HTTPS in that sense, right? Because if you don't enter or have to enter any kind of credentials or personal information, then it's not that critical in that sense. What I'm trying to say is it's still valuable if there is some old, outdated, whatever page out there that I try to find useful information from. So I don't think that we should, at some point, kill HTTP entirely. But obviously, we should try to raise HTTPS adoption as much as possible. And to answer your question, I hope that we see HTTPS only rather sooner than later, but it's still a 5-year plan, in my opinion, because it's like with software development, first 80% only take 20% of the time, right?